Some stories mark you before you even know they're stories at all. I was 22 when I first walked through those mahogany doors, my resume trembling in hands that had never known anything softer than dish soap and determination. The mansion stretched before me like a different world, one where crystal-caught sunlight and Persian rugs swallowed footsteps whole. I had come for the position of personal assistant, though I didn't yet understand what that would truly mean. The boss sat behind a desk the size of my childhood bedroom, his silver hair catching the morning light that streamed through windows taller than trees. Howard lived in the set of his shoulders, in the way he looked at my application without looking at me. Money spoke through his Italian leather shoes, his Swiss watch, the way the air itself seemed to bend around him. I needed the job. My mother's medical bills had mounted like storm clouds, and my night school tuition waited like an unpaid debt. When he offered me a salary that would solve every problem I'd ever known, I signed papers. I should have read more carefully. The first months passed in a blur of scheduled meetings and filtered phone calls. I learned to walk quietly on marble floors, to speak only when spoken to become invisible when his wife swept through the halls in her designer dresses. She never looked at me directly. I was furniture to her, something useful but unremarkable. His children, grown and sharp-edged, treated me like expensive help. They spoke around me, through me, as if my presence was a necessary inconvenience. The house staff, the cook, the gardener, the maid, they understood the invisible lines that carved up our world. We existed in the spaces between their lives. But he began to notice me. It started with lingering glances during dictation sessions, his eyes following the movement of my pen across paper. Then came the late-night calls to his home office, ostensibly for urgent correspondence that could have waited until morning. The work became secondary to the way he watched me move around his desk, the way his voice dropped when we were alone. I told myself it was professional. I told myself I was imagining the weight of his attention, the way the air grew thick when his wife traveled to her sister's estate, or his children disappeared to their various pursuits. I was young enough to mistake power for attraction, isolation for intimacy. The first time he touched me, I was reaching for files on the top shelf of his bookcase. His hand covered mine on the ladder's rung. Steadying me, he said. The contact lasted a moment too long, his thumb brushing across my knuckles in a way that had nothing to do with safety. I should have quit then, but my mother's medication cost more than most people's rent, and my dreams of law school lived in a bank account that had never seen more than 3 digits. So I stayed, and the touches became more frequent, more deliberate. A hand on my lower back as he passed, fingers brushing mine when he handed me documents, the space between us shrinking until I could smell his expensive cologne, feel the heat of his presence like a fever. The night it happened, rain drummed against the office windows like bullets. His wife had taken the children to their vacation home in the mountains. The staff had been dismissed early. We were alone in that vast house, shadows dancing in lamplight, and I was transcribing notes from his latest business acquisition. He poured himself a scotch from the crystal decanter, then poured another, and placed it beside my typewriter. I didn't drink alcohol, couldn't afford to develop expensive tastes, but something in his manner made refusal feel impossible. The scotch burned, but not as much as the way he looked at me when I lifted the glass, not as much as the weight of his hand when it settled on my shoulder, then traced the line of my neck. I want to say I resisted. I want to say I fought or screamed or ran, but I was 22 and alone and drowning in debt and fear, and he was everything I had never been: powerful, certain, untouchable. When he guided me to the leather sofa by the fireplace, I let him. When he whispered that I was beautiful, special, different from all the others, I believed him. Afterward, as I sat in the bathroom staring at my reflection in his gold-framed mirror, I tried to convince myself it had been my choice, that somehow, in that vast imbalance of power and need, I had chosen this. He was gentler after that night, almost tender. He brought me gifts: a pearl necklace, a silk scarf, a leather purse that cost more than my monthly salary. He told me about his loveless marriage, his distant children, the loneliness that lived in the corners of his perfect life. I was young enough to believe I could save him, foolish enough to think I was the first to try. For 3 months, I lived in that strange twilight between employee and mistress, between hope and desperation. He would summon me to his office for dictation that became stolen kisses. He would find reasons for us to work late, to travel together to his various business properties. And always, always, there was the promise never spoken but implied that someday, somehow, this could become something real. I missed my period in October, then November. The pregnancy test line appeared like a verdict, pink and undeniable, in the harsh fluorescent light of my tiny bathroom. I stared at it until my eyes watered, until the plus sign burned itself into my retinas like a brand. For a week, I carried the secret like a stone in my chest. I watched his wife at the few social functions I was required to attend, her manicured hand resting on his arm, her smile polished and empty. I watched his children, spoiled and careless, and tried to imagine my own child growing up in their shadow. When I finally told him, we were in his office, the same room where everything had begun. He was reviewing contracts, his reading glasses perched on his nose, looking every inch the successful businessman. I stood in front of his desk like a defendant awaiting sentence. The words came out in a whisper, "I'm pregnant." He set down his pen very carefully, removed his glasses, and looked at me as if I had just told him the building was on fire. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled only by the tick of his antique clock and the distant hum of traffic far below. His first question wasn't about my health or my plans or how I was feeling. It was about whether I was certain the child was his. The question hit me like a slap. In that moment, I understood how completely I had misread everything. I wasn't special. I wasn't different. I was a problem to be solved, a mistake to be corrected. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled, and began to speak in the same tone he used for firing incompetent employees. There were options, he said, solutions, procedures. The word abortion never crossed his lips, but it hung in the air between us like smoke. I stood there in my second-hand dress, my discount store shoes, and felt the last of my illusions crumble. This man who had whispered poetry into my hair, who had told me I was beautiful, who had made me believe I was worth something, he was looking at me like I was garbage to be disposed of. When I didn't respond, when I couldn't force words through the knot in my throat, his manner shifted. He became practical, efficient. He would provide money, he said, enough to handle the situation discreetly, enough to relocate, perhaps, to start fresh somewhere else. His tone suggested this was generous, magnanimous even. I found my voice then, small and shaking. What if I want to keep it? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. His expression hardened into something I had never seen before. Not the powerful businessman, not the lonely husband, but something colder, something dangerous. That wouldn't be wise, he said. The threat lived in the spaces between his words, in the way his eyes never left mine, in the sudden understanding that I had never known this man at all. Everything I thought we had shared, every touch, every whispered word, every stolen moment had been a transaction to him, and now the bill was due. I was dismissed from his employment that afternoon, terminated for performance issues, he said, though my work had always been exemplary. The paperwork was already prepared, the severance check calculated to the penny, efficient, clean, final. 3 weeks later, I was living in a one-room apartment above a laundromat, surviving on instant soup and the dwindling remains of my savings. The morning sickness had begun, waves of nausea that doubled me over at the most inconvenient moments. I had managed to find work as a night shift clerk at a 24-hour diner, but the standing made my feet swell, and the grease smell triggered my nausea. I had just returned from my shift, dawn light creeping through my cracked window, when I heard the car outside. It was a black sedan, expensive and gleaming, parked in front of the laundromat, like a shark among minnows. 2 men in suits knocked on my door. They were polite, professional, their faces forgettable in the way of hired muscle. They had an offer from their employer. They said, a generous offer, a final offer. The envelope they placed on my scratched kitchen table contained more money than I had ever seen, enough to disappear, to relocate, to start over somewhere far away. All I had to do was sign a document stating that I would never contact their employer or his family again, never make any claims about paternity, never seek any support or acknowledgement. In essence, I would agree to erase myself and my child from his story entirely. The men waited while I read through the legal language, their presence filling my tiny apartment like fog. Outside, the laundromat's machines hummed their industrial lullaby, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at the morning. What if I don't sign? I asked. The taller one smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Their employer was a powerful man, he said, influential, connected. It would be unfortunate if complications arose, difficulties with future employment, housing applications, credit approvals. Such a shame when promising young women found doors closing instead of opening. The message was clear. Sign, or be destroyed, systematically, professionally, completely. I signed with a pen that trembled in my hand, my signature authorizing my own erasure. They drove me out of the city that same morning. I sat in the back seat of their expensive car, watching familiar landmarks disappear in the side mirror, my hastily packed suitcase on the seat beside me. The driver followed roads that grew progressively smaller, more remote, until the pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt. We drove for what felt like hours, deeper into countryside I had never seen, past farms and forests and fields that stretched to the horizon. The car kicked up clouds of dust that hung in the air like accusations, coating everything in a fine layer of abandonment. Finally, we stopped. The road was nothing more than packed earth, rutted by tractor wheels and scarred by weather. On either side stretched empty farmland, brown stubble poking through patches of snow. In the distance, a cluster of buildings huddled against the winter sky. A town, maybe, or just another collection of forgotten dreams. The men got out first, their city shoes crunching on frost-hardened ground. The taller one opened my door with mock courtesy, gesturing for me to step out. "This is where you get off," he said. I stared at him, not understanding. We were nowhere, surrounded by nothing. The nearest building was a mile away at least, maybe more. The winter wind cut through my thin coat like a blade, carrying the smell of dead leaves and distant wood smoke. "But the car," I said. The money was supposed to include transportation to wherever I wanted to go. The shorter man handed me my suitcase from the trunk. "Plans change," he said. Their employer felt this arrangement was more appropriate. They left me there on that dirt road with my suitcase and $23 in my purse and a 3-month pregnancy that made my head spin with morning sickness. Their expensive car disappeared in a cloud of dust, taking with it my last connection to the world I had known. I stood in that emptiness for a long time, watching the dust settle, feeling the weight of abandonment pressed down on me like a physical thing. The silence was absolute. No traffic, no voices, no signs of life beyond the distant buildings, and the crows calling from bare trees. The walk to town took 47 minutes. I counted every step, every breath cloud that froze in the air before me. My suitcase grew heavier with each mile, the handle cutting into my palm, but I didn't dare set it down. Everything I owned was in that case: my clothes, my certificates, my photograph of my mother, my high school diploma, all that remained of the person I used to be. The town was called Millbrook, though I didn't learn that until later. Population 847, according to a weathered sign that someone had used for target practice. It was the kind of place people drove through without stopping, where the main street held a gas station, a diner, a hardware store, and not much else. I collapsed at a bus stop that probably hadn't seen a bus in years, my suitcase beside me, my hands shaking from more than cold. A few people passed, farmers in worn jackets, children walking home from school, but no one met my eyes. In a town that small, strangers stood out like blood on snow, and I was clearly not the kind of stranger they wanted to acknowledge. The diner was called Millie's, its neon sign flickering pink and blue against the gray afternoon. Inside, the warmth hit me like a blessing, along with the smell of coffee and fried food that made my pregnant stomach lurch. I slid into a booth in the back, ordered tea and toast I could barely afford, and tried to figure out what to do next. The waitress was older, maybe 50, with kind eyes and practical shoes. When she saw me counting change for the tip, something in her expression softened. "You okay, honey?" she asked. The question nearly broke me. It was the first kind word I'd heard in weeks, and I had to press my lips together to keep from crying. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and she squeezed my shoulder before moving on to the next table. I spent that night in the bus station, dozing fitfully on a wooden bench, my suitcase clutched to my chest like armor. When morning came, I was still there, still pregnant, still alone, but somehow still breathing. The next 3 years passed like a fever dream of survival. I found work where I could, cleaning offices, stocking shelves, waiting tables when my growing belly didn't make customers uncomfortable. I rented a room above the hardware store, so small I could touch both walls with my arms spread. But it was mine, and it was shelter, and it kept the rain off my head. The pregnancy progressed in that tiny room, marked by visits to a county clinic 40 minutes away by bus. The doctor was kind but overworked, the nurses efficient but distant. I attended prenatal classes where other women talked about nursery themes and baby names, while their husbands rubbed their backs. I sat in the back row, taking notes I didn't need, pretending I wasn't completely, utterly alone. My daughter was born on a Tuesday in March, during a spring storm that rattled the hospital windows. Labor lasted 14 hours, and when it was over, when they placed her on my chest, I looked into her eyes and saw my own face, looking back but stronger, somehow, more determined, as if she had inherited all my stubbornness and none of my fear. I named her Sarah, after my grandmother. a woman who had raised 7 children during the Depression and never once complained about her lot in life. Sarah and I lived in that room above the hardware store for 2 years. I worked double shifts at the diner while she stayed with Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who lived across the hall. Mrs. Henderson had raised 6 children of her own and understood the particular exhaustion of single motherhood. She never asked questions about Sarah's father, never commented on the absence of wedding photos or family pictures. She simply appeared each morning at 7 o'clock sharp, ready to love another child who needed loving. On Sarah's 2nd birthday, everything changed. I was walking home from my evening shift at the diner, bone-tired and thinking about the bills that never seemed to get smaller, when I saw the helicopter. It was flying low over the town, its searchlight cutting through the darkness like a sword. The sound of its rotors filled the night air, urgent and purposeful. A child had gone missing from one of the farms outside town, a 4-year-old boy who had wandered into the woods during the afternoon and hadn't been found by nightfall. The volunteer fire department had been searching for hours, but the terrain was rough and the darkness made progress slow. The helicopter was their last hope. I stood on Main Street with half the town, watching that machine work its way across the landscape in careful grids, its light probing the shadows between trees. There was something mesmerizing about its movement, something almost graceful in the way it danced through the air. Death and salvation balanced on spinning blades. They found the boy an hour later, cold and scared but alive, curled under a fallen log 3 miles from his house. The helicopter landed in the town square, its rotors stirring dust and litter into whirlwinds, and the pilot climbed out to help transfer the child to the waiting ambulance. The pilot was a woman. I don't know why that surprised me so much. Maybe because I had never seen a woman do anything that looked like freedom, anything that required that much skill and courage and control. She was tall and confident, moving with the easy assurance of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of. When she pulled off her helmet, her hair was gray and pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her eyes held the kind of calm that only comes from facing down death and winning. Something shifted inside me as I watched her work, a recognition I couldn't name, a possibility I had never imagined. For the first time since that night in the boss's office, for the first time since the dirt road and the abandonment and all the years of just surviving, I felt something that might have been hope. The next morning, I called the regional airport and asked about flight training. It took me 7 years to become a certified helicopter pilot, 7 years of working double shifts to pay for lessons, of studying flight manuals while Sarah slept, of slowly, methodically building a skill that felt like learning to breathe underwater. The training was expensive and demanding, requiring a precision I had never applied to anything in my life. But something about flying made sense to me. Maybe it was the absolute nature of it, the way you were either in control or you were dead, with no middle ground for self-doubt or hesitation. Maybe it was the solitude, the way the cockpit became a cocoon where only competence mattered, where my past was irrelevant and my future was measured in altitude and airspeed. I learned to read weather patterns like scripture, to feel the helicopter's moods through my hands and feet, to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between rescue and catastrophe. I practiced emergency procedures until they became instinct, until I could auto-rotate a failing aircraft to safety without conscious thought. The other student pilots were mostly men, mostly younger, mostly convinced that flying was a gentleman's sport. They treated me with polite condescension at first, then growing respect as I outperformed them in navigation tests and emergency simulations. By the time I earned my commercial license, they had stopped seeing me as an anomaly and started seeing me as competition. Sarah grew up around hangars and maintenance sheds, doing her homework in airport waiting rooms while I logged flight hours. She learned to identify aircraft by their engine sounds, to read sectional charts like other children read comic books. She understood that our life was different, harder, but she never complained. She seemed to understand instinctively that we were building something together, brick by brick, flight hour by flight hour. When I was 32, I joined the regional search and rescue team. The work was demanding and dangerous, requiring a level of precision that left no room for error. We responded to missing hikers, stranded climbers, victims of car accidents in remote areas. Each call was a puzzle to be solved, with limited time and infinite ways to fail. but I was good at it. Better than good. The same survival instincts that had gotten me through pregnancy and abandonment and 7 years of scraping by now served me in the cockpit. I could read terrain like a map, feel weather changes in my bones, navigate by instinct when instruments failed. My colleagues respected my skills, relied on my judgment, trusted me with lives that hung in the balance. Sarah was 14 when I realized we had made it. Not just survived, but succeeded. We lived in a small house, now, nothing fancy but ours, with a garden and a porch swing and photographs on the mantel. Sarah was honors roll at school, planning for college, talking about becoming a doctor or maybe an engineer. She had grown into the person I had always hoped she could be, strong and confident and unafraid of the world. And I had become someone to not the frightened girl who had signed those papers with shaking hands, not the abandoned woman left on a dirt road with nothing but a suitcase and determination. I was a pilot, a rescuer, someone people called when hope was the only thing left. 25 years passed before I saw him again. It was a Tuesday in September, the kind of crisp fall day that made flying feel like dancing with the wind. I was on call, sitting in the pilot's lounge at the regional medical center, when the alert came through. Flash flooding in the eastern counties had trapped several people in their homes, including a family at an isolated estate in the hills. The coordinates were familiar, though it took me a moment to place them. As we lifted off and banked toward the mountains, as the landscape below took shape, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with altitude. I knew these roads. I had driven them once, years ago, in the back seat of a black sedan. I knew the curve of the river, the way the hills folded into each other, the expensive privacy that money could buy. The estate came into view like a memory materializing vast lawns, now under 2 feet of muddy water. The circular drive submerged, the mansion itself sitting on higher ground, but completely cut off from the outside world. A helicopter pad had been added since my time there, but it was underwater now, useless. Through the aircraft's cameras, I could see them on the second-floor balcony. 4 figures, waiting for rescue that might not come if the weather continued to deteriorate. The man was older now, his silver hair white, his posture stooped with age, but I recognized him instantly, the way you recognize the shape of your own scar. My co-pilot was running through the approach checklist when I realized I hadn't said a word since we'd taken off. He glanced at me, concerned. "You okay, Captain?" he asked. I nodded, my hands steady on the controls, my voice calm when I responded, "Just planning the approach. Tricky conditions." It was tricky. The floodwater had turned the estate grounds into a lake, with debris and power lines creating invisible hazards. The wind was gusting unpredictably, bouncing off the hills in ways that could slam an aircraft into the ground without warning. A less experienced pilot might have declared the rescue impossible, waited for conditions to improve, but I had been flying for 25 years. I had pulled people off mountain peaks in blizzards, out of canyons in sandstorms, from rooftops in hurricanes. This was just another mission, just another problem to solve with skill and patience and the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of. I brought the helicopter into a hover 50 feet above the balcony, the rotor wash whipping the floodwater into spray that caught the afternoon light like diamonds. Through the windscreen, I could see them clearly now, him, his wife, their adult son, and a young woman who might have been a daughter-in-law or a caregiver. The wife was pale with fear, clutching the balcony railing as if it might save her. The son looked angry, the way entitled people look when the world fails to accommodate them. The young woman seemed calm, competent, probably the one who had thought to call for help. And him, he stood slightly apart from the others, his expensive clothes sodden, his face turned up toward the helicopter. For a moment, as I maneuvered into position for the rescue, our eyes met through the windscreen. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? I was just another pilot in a helmet and headset, another professional doing a job. The frightened girl he had discarded on a dirt road was as invisible to him now as she had been then, but I knew him. Every line of his face, every gesture, every expression. 25 years had passed, but some things are burned too deep to fade. My co-pilot was lowering the rescue basket, talking to the family through the loudspeaker, coordinating their extraction with the calm professionalism of someone who had done this 100 times before. The wife went first, then the son, then the young woman. Each time, I held the aircraft in a perfect hover, compensating for wind and weight shifts with minute adjustments of the controls. And then, It was just him on the balcony. He stepped into the basket with the careful dignity of a man who had never doubted that rescue would come, that people would risk their lives to save his, even in crisis, even surrounded by the consequences of forces beyond his control. He carried himself like someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. As the basket rose toward the helicopter, as my co-pilot guided him through the cargo door, I kept my eyes on the instruments: airspeed, altitude, fuel remaining, engine temperatures, the numbers that mattered, the data that kept people alive. He was aboard now, strapped into a passenger seat, breathing hard from fear and exertion. Through the intercom, I could hear him talking to my co-pilot, thanking him for the rescue, already shifting into the mode of someone who would turn this near disaster into a story of his own courage and survival. We flew back to the medical center in relative silence. The rescued family huddled in their seats, processing their brush with disaster. At the hospital, they were met by reporters and relatives, by doctors who checked them for injuries they didn't have, by insurance adjusters who would calculate the cost of their ordeal in dollars and cents. I watched from the pilot's seat as he stood in the parking lot, already giving interviews, already transforming his helplessness into a narrative of resilience. He was still powerful, still connected, still someone whose near-death experience would be front-page news in the morning papers. And I was still invisible to him, just another pilot in another helicopter, doing a job he would never think to appreciate. I flew home that evening as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Sarah was waiting for me in the kitchen of our small house, reading acceptance letters from medical schools, her future spread before her like a map of possibilities. She looked up when I came in, studying my face with the perceptiveness of someone who had learned to read moods in the subtle changes of expression. "Tough day?" she asked. I kissed the top of her head, breathed in the scent of her shampoo, felt the solid reality of her presence. "Not tough," I said, "just interesting." That night, I sat on our porch swing, listening to the crickets and watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere across the state, he was probably safe in some expensive hotel, calling his lawyer, his insurance company, his business associates, already planning how to rebuild, how to recover, how to return to the life he had always known. I thought about the girl I had been 25 years ago, standing on that dirt road with her suitcase, and her terror, and her unborn child. I thought about all the nights I had lain awake wondering if I would survive, if we would make it, if there would ever come a day when the fear would finally let me go. I had never imagined this moment, had never dreamed that someday I would be the one with the power, the one whose skills could mean the difference between life and death, the one who could choose to save or abandon someone who had once abandoned me. But in the end, there had been no choice at all. Not because I forgave him. Forgiveness was too complicated, too generous for what he had done, and not because I wanted revenge. Revenge was a luxury I had never been able to afford. I saved him because that's who I had become, because 25 years of surviving had taught me that strength isn't about getting even or settling scores. It's about becoming someone who can be counted on when everything falls apart, someone who shows up when others can't or won't, someone who does the right thing even when the wrong thing would be easier. Sarah graduated medical school 3 years later. She specialized in emergency medicine, drawn to the same edge where life and death danced their eternal dance. She works in trauma centers now, saving lives with the same quiet competence I learned in cockpits, carrying forward something we built together from nothing but determination and hope. I still fly rescue missions, though not as many as I used to. The younger pilots are taking over, men and women who learned their skills in peacetime, who never had to choose between paying for flight lessons and buying groceries. They're good pilots, maybe better than I ever was, and I'm proud to have trained some of them. Sometimes, when I'm flying alone on a clear day, I think about that girl on the dirt road. I wonder what she would think of the woman I became, whether she would recognize herself in my hands on the controls, my voice calm on the radio, my ability to navigate through storms that would have terrified her. I think she would be surprised, not by the success or the respect or the comfortable life we built, though those things would amaze her. She would be surprised by the peace, by the way I sleep now without nightmares, the way I can meet my own eyes in the mirror, the way I've learned to carry the past without letting it carry me. He never knew who saved him that day. He never learned that his rescue pilot was the girl he had discarded like trash, the problem he had paid to disappear. In his story, he was saved by anonymous professionals, heroic strangers who materialized when needed and vanished when their job was done. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. because this was never really about him. It was about the girl who refused to disappear, who built herself into someone worth saving, who learned that the best revenge is becoming someone you never imagined you could be. The helicopter sits in the hangar now, gleaming in the fluorescent light, ready for the next call, the next emergency, the next person who needs someone to show up when hope is the only thing left. And I'm ready too. Some stories mark you before you even know their stories at all. But the best stories, the ones that matter, the ones that change everything, those are the stories where you get to write the ending yourself.